gang. It's been a while since we've done one of these, right? I know you love them. Let's see if we can patch this together. I think this one takes the lead in terms of the worst headstock breaks. It moves ahead of that Slash Les Paul from a couple of years ago that people were very enthused about, because the neck in this case is thinner and the break is even more vertical. There's like no overlapping grain in this one. So the techniques I'm going to use will probably be very similar. We'll need a lot of supporting wood. What do I mean when I say it's a vertical break? Take a look at this old Gibson headstock. Don't worry, you'll see this guitar in a week or two. It broke all the way through the headstock, but you see how the two halves of the break meet each other at a long angle? That means that there's far more surface area here for the glue to hold on to. They kind of support each other better, and rather than a porous end grain surface, there's some side grain here. It's much stronger. That means that even with a not so great glue up, I mean this is slightly misaligned and it's not really done to what I consider a professional standard, this functions and it will hold together. I think it's been holding for years at this point. This is an Epiphone DOT 335 style guitar, and right now approximately 2% of those watching are getting furious because they don't understand why someone would have this repaired rather than buying another one. The cost analysis doesn't make sense, and little blood vessels are rupturing in their eyes, and you know, they're just wound too tight, these people. Stay away from them if you can, because they're apt to hurt you. People love their guitars. This person would rather fix his favorite rather than go searching for another one, so I can put it back together for him. Just relax. Oh, and for those of you who are seriously concerned about my cuticles, I hear you. I know, it's awful. But last week I was involved in a job that required me to pull out a bridge plate that was very obstinate, and I was rubbing my hand against an unsanded brace on the top, full of splinters, basically like rubbing my fingers against sandpaper for half an hour. These things happen. To start off with, I managed once again to lose an integral piece of footage by not pressing record, or maybe double pressing it, I don't know. Anyway, I started off by aligning the break and using a little gel viscosity super glue while I became a human clamp for a couple of minutes to hold this thing together. Super glue is not the preferred adhesive, but in this case I'm going to be cutting away virtually all of the wood in that area. There won't be any super glue left when I'm done. Just there to keep things together while that whole process happens. Let's talk about evaluating this and setting up to chop out some big chunks from it. My main goal is to span or cross over the broken area with clean, sound wood. Basically like providing a permanent splint to support it from both sides. Sort of like a knee brace, but it's integral. And these splints have to attach to solid, healthy material away from the zone of fracture. They need to extend past it, in other words. I like it to be about as long for each side as the broken area is wide. So in this case, the neck is about 1 3/4 inches wide. The splints are going to extend past about total length of about 3.5 inches. There are practical limits imposed mainly because of the angled headstock here. Making them too long will have the effect of decreasing their depth, because if they're too long I could route through the front face of the headstock with this system. There are other ways of doing this. That would be a real bummer, because in this case it's undamaged, and I think we should keep it that way if we can. So we have the length. What about the width? I'm going to go all the way to the edge of the neck in this case. In the center here, I need to stay away from the truss rod. I don't want to be routing into that. I can measure its width and add a couple of millimeters on either side for safety. So I'll cut a piece of tape the correct width, and I'll center that by eye. That will give me some guide when I'm setting up my routing jig. This guitar is painted black, which gives me every option in the world. This neck is mahogany of some kind. It's not a true mahogany. It's like African mahogany or Southeast Asian variety that they're sort of cousins because they kind of look like mahogany, but it's not the real deal. It's not Honduran. If this was painted in a transparent color or a clear finish, I'd use a material that looks as similar as I could find. With black, however, I'm going to go with maple for a couple of reasons. The first is that it's stiffer. The modulus of elasticity for hard maple is about 1.8 million pounds per square inch on the stiffness chart, versus about 1.4 million for African mahogany. And it's got what we call closed grain. The pores of the wood are very small and they don't need to be filled before applying lacquer, which actually saves me a step in the finishing process. I'll take a few minutes and glue up my routing template. I have a number of these kicking around, but they never seem to be exactly the right size I need for any particular job, so it doesn't take very long to make them. I don't begrudge the, 10 minutes worth of effort. This is quarter sawn maple. You'll hear that a lot when talking to guitar makers. What does it mean? Well, if you look at the end of a log, the surface on which you see all the concentric rings, as if it was a piece of firewood, looking at the end of it, quarter sawn means splitting it into 4 pieces, kind of like a pie, if you're really hungry, and then sawing parallel to one of those faces, something like this, to create boards. If you look at the end of the board, you'll see that the grain lines run straight up and down, perpendicular to the face, like this. They don't angle off in one direction or the other. This is the stiffest, most stable way to cut a piece of wood. In other words, if you dry it and then cut it into a rectangular cross section like this, with changes in humidity, it retains the same shape. It can expand and contract a little bit with changes in humidity, but it's always going to stay a rectangle, versus something else that has angled grain or it's more convoluted. This is far more unstable. It tends to move more with the seasons. It's more prone to cupping or bowing, that kind of thing. And when it's finished drying out, oftentimes it's no longer square. It turns into something like a parallelogram. Looks like that. Now, it so happens that when you quarter saw maple, you end up exposing what we call the ray flex on its surface, on the quartered surfaces. These are cell channels that run across the grain of the tree, from the bark to the center, and they're used to store and move sugars and other nutrients around. On maple, the more perfectly quartered it is, the longer these appear. So if you look at any good violin bridge, you'll see this pattern. And in fact, those bridges are actually graded according to how long these flecks are. They're looking for the stiffest, most dimensionally stable wood for the violin bridge. And so seeing this, I feel pretty confident using it for those splines or splints or whatever we're going to call them, inserts. How does this affect a guitar headstock? In my opinion, having stiffness in this smallest dimension of the neck here can keep the headstock more stable and less prone to having tuning issues, for one thing. Imagine the headstock is made from rubber rather than wood. What happens when we apply string tension to it? It bends forward under that pressure. Have you ever had a guitar that takes a really long time to tune? Like every time you bring a string up to pitch, the others all drop down, so you're constantly going back and forth every time, trying to keep them sort of in equilibrium and bring them all up at the same rate. There are headstocks and necks that are so spongy that this happens even when you're bending strings. It's really frustrating to try and set up one of those guitars. I'll try and describe the setup for cutting here. The first thing to know is this is not the only way to do this. Virtually everything I demonstrate has variations and alternatives. This is just something I've come up with that bridges a need for efficiency with accurate, predictable results. It's as simple a method as I could come up with. So I'm not tied to using one dedicated jig for everything, because in my experience, every break is different, and the same jig might not work for them all. At which point you've got to go back to the drawing board anyway and come up with something new. And yes, I can see ways of making this more adjustable, possibly more secure, but the time I would invest in something like that is hard to recoup. I could spend 3 days engineering a fancy device, or I can spend half an hour making a new one of these for every guitar, and that's the route I go with. The first thing to keep in mind is that this is a flat board, and so it only contacts the guitar at its ends. Any clamping pressure gets focused there. this being birch plywood, if I was to clamp it without cushioning, it would definitely leave a dent in the lacquer. It would dent the wood and the finish above. So I've got cork on both leading edges. It's just taped in place because I want to reposition it to the other side when I flip it over to do the other half of the neck. I'll also add a folded paper towel. On this other side here, I've taped an additional thick piece of cork for that corner to rest on. This has an additional purpose. It's about 5 millimeters thick. It protects, but it also raises the plane of the jig slightly for an improved angle of attack. See, the idea is I'm going to set my router bit to a depth of cut that leaves a couple of millimeters worth of thickness to the headstock on this side of travel, so I'm not in danger of cutting through the face. And on the other side, I'd like that same depth setting to bring me close to, but not into, the fingerboard. And that would be as deep as I can go, practically speaking, with a flat template. You could come up with something like a radius setup that might get you another millimeter or two's depth worth in the middle there. That's a fancy jig. Or you could try and make something that clamps the guitar in place on the bench and has this thing as an adjustable riser that moves back and forth and adjusts for the angle, and maybe with adjustable depth stops to limit the length and the width of the cut. I'll tell you now that registering the radiused fingerboard against a flat surface can take a lot of trial and error to get it locked in right where it should be, and so that you can just flip this over and have the same depth setting for your router. It adds a level of rechecking everything. Whereas this takes advantage of the nice flat surface of the headstock, and on this side it's essentially point contact because of the radius on the neck. So it's kind of like a tripod. It's very stable, and again, it's as simple as it gets. Oh, someone asked me recently if they could just cut the spline recesses by hand because the routing setup might be beyond their current skill. And all I can say there is, unless you apprenticed with a Japanese cabinet maker, it's very difficult to cut these mortises accurately enough by hand because they really got to be snug and perfectly fit. And recall, this thing is held together very tenuously at this point with just a dab of super glue. So if you go beating on it with a mallet and a mortise chisel, it will break apart immediately. Okay, so I measure the depth of cut on both sides, and I find that about 39 millimeters is pretty much where I want to be. And to position the recess, I just sight down the edge of the jig to the guidelines I put on there. Don't get me wrong, in terms of routing setups, this is a technique that requires some experience. The tendency is to really white knuckle it, but if you do that, you're more prone to have something go wrong. Because the template is clamped fairly securely, but if you push too firm against it, it could move on you. The other thing is, I've made this with support on one side of the router base plate only, because it's quick and I'm confident. Having support on both sides might be helpful. So I cut a plug to fit, and it has to fit very well, both lengthwise and horizontally. This is where the new structural integrity comes from. We want solid wood-to-wood contact here. So glue it up. I'm using Tight Bond. You could use hot glue or something else. With a good clean fit, any of the usual adhesives will make something stronger than the surrounding wood. I'll press that home, and to clamp it, I'll use surgical tubing. This stuff works great on surfaces that don't have a lot of right angles for you to get a clamp on, and it's really powerful. Someone once said that you could cut an elephant in half if you put enough wraps on. Second verse, same as the first. To get the radius, I lop off the corners, and I just sand it till it fits. I'll show this again later. On to carving. To do this, you'll see me use a number of different grips and hand positions. Sometimes against your scout leader's wishes, I'll actually be carving towards myself. That's possible if you know about using opposing forces to limit the blade's travel. Just clearing out the bulk of the waste, and sometimes a rasp comes in handy for that. To keep the headstock area flat, I register against it with a very wide chisel here to sort of slice off the wood fibers in the same plane. Maple requires a lot more pressure to cut through than mahogany. You'll be a bit more tired at the end of the job. I'll sand the headstock portion flat. The tape keeps me just proud of the surface, so I can sneak up and leave enough for the final scraping and sanding. Here's a template for cutting a bridging plug. It mounts the same way as the previous templates. To excavate this, I'll be using what's called a hinge mortising bit. It's designed for plunging, but I'm going to be doing this in a series of passes that are less than a millimeter's depth, because it's hard to know just how deep the rod will be because it curves in the neck. And in this case, I got lucky. I decided to stop when I just grazed the rubber sleeve on the rod, and on the other side, I can burnish the wood against the anchor. You see that? Don't go any deeper than that. So I'll plane this plug to dimension. I'll put the 1/4 inch radius on each side with a circle template here. This is a handy thing to have. I'll chop off those corners and I'll sand it using a block. That's the sound of a good fit. Let's talk about this plug and why it's there. These two splines have, I think, enough gluing surface area to hold things together, and they're stiff enough to do the job. So I suppose I could just put some fill in that little crack and level it off, and it would probably be all right. But this plug adds more surface area. It bridges the fracture as well behind it, and therefore increases the stiffness. But there's another component too. Because it's inlaid tightly into the recess, it has a kind of bolstering effect. In the way that the walls of a residential building have diagonal bracing at the corners to keep them from racking in high winds, this recess contacts the plug on 5 sides and prevents it from moving if the headstock is subjected to tension or compression. Also, it physically locks the splines and the original wood of the headstock together. It's like the difference between a glued butt joint and finger joints or dovetails in drawer construction. This provides resistance to racking. It could be longer, but that would probably entail making this area of the neck thicker, which may or may not be a good thing, depending on your perspective. There's another technique called the backstrap overlay. I don't think I've shown that in a video yet. It's also useful. In that one, a veneer is applied to the back of the headstock, full width. This is just what I happen to have kicking around here. It's too narrow. But anyway, it gets glued to the back of the headstock, and it travels down over the surface of the neck. Sometimes this is used to create extra thickness that can be carved into a volute where there was no volute before. Those work too. I always want to see them inlaid into the original wood rather than just sitting on top. And that's not hard, because oftentimes you're trying to preserve a serial number stamped on the headstock up here. So they'll usually go to the middle of the upper set of tuners and travel down. But again, rather than just lying on top of the surface, you want to put them into a recess of some kind. So you get that mechanical locking thing happening again and some resistance to racking. Also extra thickness, People who use the simple thin veneer, more often than not, it's just to hide, say, breakage in the headstock. Oftentimes in Martin guitars, where the mahogany is broken and you can see it, people will put on a very thin backstrap of mahogany, so that gets disguised. But for structural support, you want a couple of millimeters at least to go into the wood. So now it's just a question of carving away everything that doesn't look like a headstock. This is a cabinet maker's file. It's flat on one side and curved on the other. And that helps to smooth and fair the lines a little bit better. Now we're getting into the real refining cuts, working on that sweeping transition between the head and the neck. Here's a good view of one of those alternate hand positions I was talking about. I'm using one finger there to kind of guide the knife. The nice thing about these Swedish style carving knives is they have flat bevels that are really wide. And that provides a lot of control, especially on these curved surfaces, because they're almost self-guiding at a certain point. They help you make straight lines. This is a little wooden spoke shave available through Lee Valley. I'm not sure if it still is, but it's I think it was made in Indonesia. Very simple, old style, low angle spoke shave. And yeah, does a good job of hogging away some of the waste material. When I'm doing the shaping here, most of my movements are concerned with going in line with the neck. Yeah, I'm thinking about the rounded cross-section of the profile, but in order to achieve it, most of my moves are going backwards and forwards like this, rather than like this. In a process of continual refinement, I start using abrasives, in this case sandpaper wrapped around a dowel, which helps me in that curved transition area. Keeps the surface straight, but also allows me to get into the curve. For the actual shaft of the neck, I'll start with a strip of flexible sanding belt. It's not easy to make a really fair continuation of the neck shape. It involves repeated checking with your hands and looking at shadows on the surface and raking light. There's always a little wiggle in the reflection somewhere when you're done. You just have to sort of get it as close as you can and be satisfied. I'll raise the wood grain with a damp cloth, let it dry. Little whiskers will appear and I'll sand it smooth again, then I can spray. I'm using a rattle can of black Tamiya Model Maker's lacquer. It's got good coverage and a really consistent spray. I try and follow the curve with my wrist movement here. And thin coats are better than thick coats. Okay, 2 light misting coats. I let it sit overnight. And this throws into high relief a couple little spots, some tiny divots along one of the splines here that I'm going to fill with some glue. I'll let this dry, level it off, put another coat of black on, then I'll do some clear coats. With lacquer, it's important to leave enough time for it to fully cure and shrink up before level sanding and polish. Longer is definitely better, the longer you can wait. You could do it after like 3 days, but pretty soon you'll see the outline of the inlays as the finish contracts. In the meantime, I'll do some fret polishing and fit a new nut in place. This Graphtec comes a little too wide for this model, so I'll sand it to width on a block and polish the sides with micro mesh. I'm going to leave it here. You guys will have to imagine what it sounds like. I'm sure there are audio examples of Epiphone pickups in other videos. I don't want to have to put on the tuners, then take them off again in a few days to do the polishing, but I'll demonstrate by getting rid of some of the overspray on the top of the headstock here with automotive polish, just to get rid of that gritty feeling. Little particles stick to the finish when you're spraying. Anyway, see you guys next week. I got a real doozy for you. Thanks for watching.